Papers were already on the kitchen table when I came downstairs that morning. My daughter-in-law had left them there like they were nothing, like they were a grocery list or a reminder to call the plumber. But I knew exactly what they were the moment I saw my own signature at the bottom of the last page. Except I had never signed them. I stood there in my socks on the cold tile floor holding my coffee mug, and I read every word twice. A quitclaim deed. The house I had lived in for 31 years. The house where my son took his first steps. Where my wife and I painted the kitchen 3 different shades of yellow before we finally agreed on the right one. Where I built the back deck with my own hands the summer before she got sick, transferred to my son and his wife jointly. Effective immediately upon notarization. And there, at the bottom, my name in handwriting that was close but not quite right. The loop on the G was too wide. I had been signing my name for 63 years. I knew what it looked like. I set the coffee mug down very carefully on the counter. Then I picked up the papers and read them a third time. My son and his wife had moved in with me 14 months earlier. That was how it started. The way these things always start, gradually, with reasonable explanations. He had been laid off from his project management job when the company restructured. She was between positions, she said, though I was never entirely clear on what positions those had been. They had a lease that was ending. The timing was bad. Could they stay with me for a few months just until they got back on their feet? I said yes. Of course I said yes. He was my son. My wife had been gone for 4 years by then. The house was too large for one person. I knew that, had known it since the first winter when I realized I was only using 3 of the 7 rooms. There was a guest room, there was the spare room where my wife had kept her sewing things, there was the office I had set up when I retired from the county assessor's office after 32 years. There was space. There was more than enough space, so they moved in. His name was my son. Her name was his wife, and in those early weeks she called me Dad and brought me coffee in the mornings and asked about my wife, what she had been like, what she had loved, whether I missed her. I did miss her. I missed her. I missed her every single day. And it felt good, I will admit that, to have the house full of noise again. Footsteps overhead. The television on in the evenings. Someone to eat dinner with. The first time my son asked me for money, it was 3 months in. He needed to cover a car payment, just this once. He would pay me back by the end of the month. It was $400. I gave it to him without making him feel small about it, because I knew what it was to struggle, and because he was my son, and that is what fathers do. He did not pay me back by the end of the month. By month 6, I had given him close to $9,000 in small amounts. Car payments, a credit card balance that was causing him stress, the cost of a certification course he said would help him get hired faster. His wife had found part-time work at a nail salon, but, she explained, the income was inconsistent. I did not ask too many questions. I did not want to seem like I was keeping score. But I was keeping score. Not because I wanted to, because something had shifted in the house that I couldn't name, but could feel the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives. My son had stopped looking me in the eye the way he used to. His wife had stopped asking about my wife. They had started having conversations that went quiet when I walked into the room. Small things. The kind of things that, taken individually, mean nothing. Taken together, they kept me awake at 2 in the morning looking at the ceiling. 7 months in, my son sat down with me at the kitchen table, the same table where I would later find those papers, and he told me he had been talking to a financial advisor. He thought it might make sense, for tax purposes, for estate planning purposes, to have the house in both our names, just to make the transfer easier eventually, he said, when the time came. He didn't say when, what time came, but we both knew what he meant. I told him I would think about it. I had no intention of thinking about it. I had an attorney, the same one who had handled my wife's estate, and I had already updated my will 2 years earlier. Everything was in order. The house would go to my son when I died, which I hoped would not be for quite some time, since I was 63 years old, walked 3 miles every morning, and had the blood pressure of a man 20 years younger, according to my doctor. My son brought it up again in month 9, and again in month 11. Each time I said I would think about it, and each time he let it go, but the silence after was different from the silence before. Then I found the papers. I stood at the kitchen counter for a long time after I read them the 3rd time. long enough for the coffee to go cold, long enough for the morning light to move across the floor and reach the leg of the table where the papers had been sitting. I was thinking about the signature, about the G with a loop that was too wide, about the fact that someone had sat down somewhere in my house and practiced writing my name until they thought it was good enough. I thought about my wife. I thought about what she would say if she was standing next to me right now. I knew exactly what she would say. She would say, "Don't yell, don't confront, don't give them the chance to explain it away." She had always been the more strategic of the two of us. I had always been the one who wanted to say the thing out loud. She was the one who made me wait. I waited. I put the papers back exactly where I had found them. I smoothed them flat and lined up the edges the way they had been. Then I went upstairs, showered, got dressed, and drove to my attorney's office without calling ahead. His assistant recognized me and got him out of a meeting. I spread the papers on his desk and he read them without speaking. When he finished, he looked up at me and said, very quietly, that he needed to make a phone call. I sat in the chair across from his desk while he called someone. I didn't catch who, and spoke in the kind of low, careful voice that told me this was serious. When he hung up, he told me that the notarization stamp on the documents was real. Someone had obtained a notarization, which meant either the notary had been deceived about my identity or had been paid to look the other way. Either way, it was fraud. Document fraud, forgery of a signature on a property transfer deed. He listed the charges the way you list items in a grocery store, methodically, without drama. He told me what I needed to do. I needed to do nothing, nothing visible, nothing that would let them know I had seen the papers. I drove home. My son's car was gone. He had started doing rideshare work in the mornings, which I had been glad about, or had been glad about before I understood what I was actually looking at. His wife's car was in the driveway. I parked, went inside, said good morning to her in the kitchen, poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, and asked if she wanted me to pick up anything from the grocery store later. She said milk and the good bread, the sourdough from the bakery on Clement Street. I said sure. I went to the bakery. I bought the bread. I came home and put it on the counter, and we had a perfectly normal afternoon. That evening my attorney called and told me that he had been in contact with someone he trusted in the county recorder's office and that the deed had not yet been filed. It had been prepared and notarized but not submitted. That was the detail that mattered. Until it was filed, the transfer had not legally occurred. My house was still my house. He told me what to do next. I drove to his office the following morning and signed a document placing the property into a revocable living trust, with myself as the sole trustee during my lifetime. My attorney filed it that afternoon. What this meant, practically, was that even if someone attempted to file the forged deed now, it would conflict with the trust documentation and the county would flag the discrepancy. The forged deed would go nowhere, and the attempt to file it would create a paper trail. My attorney had also, in the meantime, contacted a detective he knew in the financial crimes unit of the San Francisco Police Department. I want to say I felt triumphant at that point. I want to say I felt the way you feel at the end of a movie when the right thing happens. But I didn't. I sat in my car in the parking lot outside my attorney's office, and I felt very tired, and I thought about my son, not the man who was living in my house, driving strangers around in the morning to look busy while his wife figured out how to forge my signature. But the boy who used to fall asleep in the car on the way home from his Little League games, already in his uniform, cleats still on, dirt on his face, completely trusting. I thought about where that boy had gone. I drove home. I made dinner. We ate together, and the conversation was the same conversation we always had. How his day went, whether the weather was supposed to turn this week. I asked if they had any plans for the weekend. My son said maybe a drive up to the coast. I said that sounded nice. 3 days later, 2 plainclothes detectives knocked on my front door at 9 in the morning. My son and his wife were both home. I let the detectives in and then I stepped back, and I watched my son's face change when the detective said his wife's name and told her she was being detained for questioning in connection with a fraudulent property transfer. Her face went completely still, the kind of still that is not calm, the kind that is the moment before everything collapses. My son looked at me, just looked at me. He didn't say anything for a long moment, and I didn't say anything either, because there was nothing to say that was equal to what was happening. Then he said very quietly, "Did you know about this?" And I said yes. I said I had known for 8 days. He asked me why I hadn't said anything. I told him I had learned from his mother. The detectives took his wife in for questioning. She was charged 2 days later, forgery, fraud in connection with real property, and attempted grand theft, since the house was valued at well over $900,000. Her attorney would later argue she had acted alone, that my son had no knowledge of the plan. I don't know if that is true. I genuinely do not know, and I have thought about it many times since. What I know is what the detectives told me, and what my attorney told me, and what I saw with my own eyes when those papers were on my kitchen table. My son moved out the week after the arrest. He came to me before he left, and stood in the doorway of the kitchen, looking like a man who had not slept in several days, which he probably hadn't. He said he was sorry. He said he didn't know how much he had taken from me, the money, and he didn't know about the deed until after. I listened. I didn't tell him whether I believed him or not because I hadn't decided yet, and because some things take longer than a week. He asked if he could call me. I said yes. He called the following Sunday. We talked for almost an hour. It was not a comfortable conversation, but it was a real one, and I had not had a real conversation with my son in over a year, so I stayed on the phone and I listened to him and I told him some things that I had been holding on to too long. He cried. I did not cry, or I did not cry while I was on the phone. I cried later in the kitchen with a glass of water, looking out the window at the back deck I had built the summer before my wife got sick. It is strange, the way a house can feel both empty and full at the same time. Empty because the people are gone, full because everything that happened in it is still there, in the walls and the floors, and the particular way the light comes through the window over the sink in the late afternoon. My wife would have handled all of this better than I did. She would have seen it coming earlier, and she would have moved more gracefully, and she probably would have found a way to protect our son from his own mistakes while also holding him accountable for them. She was better at holding two things at once. I am learning, slowly, the way I learn most things. The living trust is still in place. The house is still mine. The morning walks are still 3 miles. The same route, past the elementary school, down to the park at the end of Fulton, back up through the neighborhood where the old fig tree grows over the sidewalk and drops fruit in September that nobody ever picks up. I have been walking that route for 11 years. I don't plan to stop. My son is in a 1-bedroom apartment in the East Bay now. He got a job, actual employment, project coordinator for a construction firm, steady hours and the salary. He sends me a text most mornings, not every morning, but most. We are building something slowly out of what's left. I don't know yet what it will look like when it's done, but I have time, and I still have the house. I still think about the morning I found those papers on the kitchen table, the coffee going cold in my hand. My own name at the bottom of a deed I never signed. What I learned from that morning had nothing to do with revenge. It had everything to do with who I chose to be in the 8 days between finding those papers and the knock on the front door. The easiest thing would have been to walk into that kitchen and say her name and hold the papers up and watch her face. Part of me wanted to. A big part. I have never been a man who was good at sitting on things. My wife used to tell me that my face gave away everything before my mouth had a chance to catch up. She was right. She was almost always right about me. But I waited. And in the waiting, I had to make a decision that had nothing to do with the law or the deed or the charges that would come later. I had to decide what kind of man I was going to be, not in the obvious sense, but in the quiet, daily sense. Was I going to act out of anger or out of clarity? Those are not the same thing, even when they feel like it. I chose clarity. I went to my attorney. I protected the house through proper channels. I let the people whose job it is to handle these things do their jobs. That choice, to act with a straight spine instead of a raised voice, is the only reason the outcome was what it was. If I had confronted her that morning, she would have had time to destroy evidence, to explain it away, to get ahead of it. My emotion would have been her escape route. There is something I have come to believe, not from reading it anywhere, but from living long enough to see patterns repeat. The people who act out of greed rarely think past the first step. Sylvia had a plan for getting her hands on the house. She did not have a plan for what happens when the person you underestimate turns out to be paying closer attention than you thought. That gap, between what she assumed about me and who I actually am, is where everything fell apart for her. And my son. That is harder to write about. I do not know, even now, how much he knew. What I know is that he was a man who had stopped doing the hard work of building his own life and had started looking around for shortcuts. That is not a character flaw you were born with. It is one that grows slowly, in small decisions, when no one, including yourself, holds you accountable. The painful thing about watching someone you love go down that road is knowing that no amount of money you hand them will pull them back. Only consequences will. And consequences, it turns out, were the one thing I had stopped providing. I think about the boy who used to fall asleep in the car after Little League. The dirt on his face. The complete trust. I did not fail that boy by calling the police. I failed him years earlier by never letting him feel the weight of his own choices. We are rebuilding now. It is slow, it is real. And it started, strangely, with the worst thing he was ever connected to. Because that was the moment the shortcuts ran out, and there was nothing left but the truth of who he was and who he still had the chance to become. I still walk 3 miles every morning. Same route, same fig tree, same light coming through the kitchen window when I get back. Some things hold, you have to let them.